Navroz Dubash is a professor of public and international affairs and the High Meadows Environmental Institute, and is a recent, and I must say, very welcome addition to the faculty of SPIA's Center for Policy Research on Energy and the Environment. He joined the Princeton faculty from India's Center for Policy Research and also the Sustainable Futures Collaborative of India, during his time there, he advised the Indian government on its climate goals and also for many years participated in IPCC. His work examines how countries, most notably countries of the Global South, deal with the twin challenges that are often seen in opposition of climate change and development. As the limits of international governance and negotiations on climate change become more and more apparent, attention is turning ever more to the question of domestic implementation. Navroz's research focus has been right there for longer than most other scholars of climate change have paid any attention to the domestic scene at all. Navroz, up to you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you to HMEI colleagues for inviting me. I'm really, really delighted to be here. I actually am particularly honored to be giving the last talk in this building before HMEI moves. I think it's a historic occasion. I really have enjoyed the talks I've been to in this building, and I'm also, to be very honest with you, a little intimidated because I'm a social scientist who works on climate change, and most of the people who I've heard are natural scientists, they're humanities scholars, they have these beautiful, visually stunning PowerPoints, and I have a lot of text for you. But hopefully I also have a few stories, and I'm also dealing with a topic that, you know, by its initial impression can be a bit of a snooze fest, right? I'm talking about institutions. But I'm hoping to convince you that this is important and relevant for those of us interested in climate change and the future prospects for addressing climate change. So what I'm going to try and do is, in a sense, I'm organizing this around two broad themes. As Michael mentioned, a lot of my work has been at the domestic level, and I think it's important for me to start out convincing you, or at least laying the case before you, as to why the starting point for solving a global collective action problem, and climate change is a global collective action problem, may not nonetheless, in fact, be at the global level. Right? So I want to sort of take 10 minutes or so to kind of paint that picture a little bit, and then make the case for why, in the whole sort of soup of things that shape national policies and implementation, why climate institutions are both understudied and, in fact, shouldn't be understudied, why we should pay some attention to them. So let me take you through first the first part and then the second. So as I said, climate change is undoubtedly a global collective action problem, in the sense that if one or two countries, even countries as large as the US or China, reduce their emissions or even get to zero, it's not going to actually solve the problem. And there is a strong incentive for all countries to free ride and wait for others to act. So this is undoubtedly a global collective action problem. What's our plan for dealing with that? Well, we periodically convene a bunch of diplomats in a room like this. This is a picture from Copenhagen in 2009. These are meetings that happen every year. And I went to Copenhagen because, in a sense, that was the point when there was a moment, a shift in the global negotiations process. I'm not going to go through the kind of chronology of this, but give you the broad brushstrokes. But the way this works is delegates sit in a room, they have text put in front of them, they haggle over the text, they suggest that certain bits and pieces of the text are not appropriate to their interest, they put them in square brackets, the text balloons from a 20-page text to a 200-page text, they then try to unwind that, they collectively decide that's impossible, and then in the second week they come up with a new text and they do it all over again until they converge on something that I'll show you in a minute. But I want to say that in addition to these halls and these conversations, there's stuff happening outside, right? So this was sort of the protests and the demonstrations again at Copenhagen, and this has got bigger and bigger every year. So the last COP, I think 100,000 people, COP being Conference of Parties, 100,000 people went, they put pressure from the outside and so on. Eventually the objective is to end up here. This is what the Paris Agreement says in its statement of objectives. It's not the only part of it. I'll show you the second part in a minute. But this is the point, right? To reach agreement on something precise like this, holding the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees and pursuing efforts to limit it to 1.5 degrees. So this is an objective. It's a clear objective. A lot of negotiation goes into this. But in addition to this, there is a bunch of other text in the objective. Increasing the ability to adapt is key. Making financial flows compatible is important. Reflecting equity and the principle of common but differentiated responsibility in respective capabilities. And if you work in climate change, you have to be able to say that in one breath because it's a really important phrase. These are all important and less precise things that reflect the messy complexity of actually doing something about climate change, right? And I'll reflect back on this. But going back to the numbers, a lot of attention gets focused on the numbers. From those numbers of 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees, what gets unleashed is an army of analysts who produce complicated graphs like this. I'm going to cut through the clutter for you. These are emissions. The black line is actual emissions numbers. All the lines here of various colors are projections of future emissions under different scenarios. These two are what the Paris targets are, 2 degrees and 1.5. These are what countries have pledged, and therefore, in various ways, shapes, and sizes, these horizontal bars are the emissions gap. This is the gap between what countries have promised and what science says is required to happen, in this case by 2030, in this case by 2035. Okay? So the temperature target is translated to an emissions goal, right? And it is the basis on which we benchmark collective progress towards this. And after this, everybody goes home. They come up with national plans and policies that lead to emissions reductions. In the Paris Agreement jargon, it's called nationally determined contributions. I'll come to that in a minute. It's important that they're nationally determined, not globally determined. And this is, in a sense, a top-down view of how the architecture works. This is our plan for solving climate change as a global collective action problem. The issue, of course, is that that's not the only way to look at this. There is also, if you like, a bottom-up view to complement that top-down view. And the bottom-up view starts with the reality that, these are headline clippings from various parts of the world, the national conversation is about things like economic pressures. South Africa, the key issue is about jobs, right? It's about the impacts of climate change, typhoons in the Philippines, fires in LA. Sometimes it's about climate politics itself. So where do we have it? In some countries, the fact that we're running out of time as an issue is itself part of the national politics, but in others it's much more about air quality. Or it might be about things that have nothing to do with climate change ostensibly, but of course have ripple effects on it. And to give you a sense of why these things matter, right? Let's just take a country like, I just looked up the numbers here, a country like the Congo, and I mentioned that because my wife has been working on it and is talking to me about it. 21% of people in the Democratic Republic of Congo have access to electricity. 1% in rural areas has access to electricity, right? So think about translating that energy context into those numbers and an emissions gap in the abstract of, an emissions gap of 12 gigatons or 15 gigatons or 20 gigatons. It's very hard to compute, right? So what does one have to do? What one has to do is find narratives that bridge these kinds of daily realities to the fact that there are these national plans and pathways that are desired. And what are the kinds of narratives people have played with, right? So this narrative is one where you have it's a commonly used cartoon like this. There's a guy, somebody up there lecturing about all the good things that would happen as a result of climate measures. And the wag in the audience is saying, what if it's all a hoax and we build a better world for nothing, right? That's the idea that actually we can do these things together. This is the idea of co-benefits. It's something I've invested a lot of time in my career, which is why my colleagues back in my organization in India gave me this for my 50th birthday. So that's the co-benefit story. And then you have kind of the existential story, right? Which is, so we're worried about economic impacts, and actually, maybe we're sort of thinking about this all wrong. The economic impacts from climate impacts might overwhelm those of addressing climate itself. Okay, so getting to kind of the analysis of how you bridge this, right? What matters? What matters are the kinds of narrative stories we tell each other. What matters is the politics around it, the policy frameworks that result, and I'm arguing the institutions, including laws and regulations, that help bridge this. And that last bit gets insufficient attention. And in a sense, this is the sphere, this is the analytic area that I want to explore and that I have been exploring. All of these are relevant. I'm going to kind of pull out the strand of the institutional story for you today, but all of these and their interaction are really important. Also, I would argue that this space of trying to figure out the bridge between what occupies political attention and getting to those clear national stories are the primary driver of climate change. Countries won't make this change because of global pressures alone. But the global remains important, right? For all the reasons we've talked about, collective action and so on. So the composite picture is really the top-down and the bottom-up together and how they interact. And the Paris Agreement, which I'm not going to get into, but just give you a schematic here, is precisely about articulating these things. You have the 2 degree and 1.5 degree objective. Paris provides for capacity and finance support, leading to these nationally determined contributions. There's a reporting of progress, and then you go back to something called a global stocktake, where every 5 years you add up through those kinds of very hairy-looking diagrams and models. You add up and you see where we are, and then countries go back and are supposed to ramp up their NDCs or nationally determined contributions. I argue that they will ramp it up mostly because they found some keys to unlocking this particular puzzle, less because of global pressure. There's an active debate in the literature on this, but my focus is really on this piece, and increasingly, as Michael said, implementation issues are at the fore. Okay? So this is the first part, why, despite the fact that this is a global collective action problem, it may make sense to start somewhere else. And I agree, and I argue that this is the somewhere else. It's this interaction at the national level, the very complex playing out of national politics. And that's where I now want to take you and pull out the strand of climate institutions, right? So turning now to why I think national climate institutions have been so far a missing piece of the climate puzzle. It's based on a project I did with a bunch of colleagues, which was very, very rewarding. We did 8 country papers, 4 developed. They were published in a special issue of Environmental Politics, and then we had a synthesis piece in Science a couple of years ago. So this is what I'm drawing on. I'm not going to mention all my colleagues by name, but this is very much collective work with all of them, and you can see some of them listed there. Okay, so what are the kinds of questions that animate why that sort of soup I mentioned, why institutions are an important part of that soup? One empirical point, one purely instrumental question is, we all know countries have to produce these NDCs. Who produces them? How do they get produced within a country? Is there a mechanism to produce it? Do you have to create something new? Do you just allocate it to somebody? Remember, these NDCs are about something that cross-cuts most ministries or departments, right? It's an economy-wide story. So what happens if you just hand that off to an environment ministry, right? This is about future emissions trajectories in the next 20, 30 years in 5-year bites, right? So where does this happen? We've already seen that energy issues, jobs, geopolitics around the changing role of Russia and China and the US and so on, all of these things inflect these NDCs. How do those different interests and understandings, where do they get reconciled and how do they get reconciled in seeking climate objectives, right? How does that happen in different countries? We have seen empirically countries producing climate laws, dedicated climate institutions. Where do they come from? What shapes them and what role do they play? Right? So empirically, there's something new there to study as of the last 10 years. And is there sort of a best practice story? I'll give you a hint here. I hate the word best practice. I don't think there are such things. I think we have to have nationally specific stories. But are there things that are common across countries? Certainly there are learnings. Is there a replication possible across countries? And so we did these case studies to try and answer questions like this. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to give you kind of a schematic of the thought process and then go into a couple of cases, because I think it's the stories that are really enriching. So the schematic is this, right? Just focus on the left part of this diagram. Typically, the way political scientists and others have thought about this is you try and understand the nature of national climate politics. It has something to do with business interests. You know, do you have fossil fuel interests that are dominant? Do you have an emergent renewable energy industry? Do you have, like in Germany, an auto industry that's dominant? How does that work? Do you have strong and organized civil society, or do you live in a state where civil society doesn't have much voice? If you have civil society, do they have safeguards and so on and so forth? Are they thinking about climate change in the way that one would hope they would? Or in the case of India, we found actually civil society pushed back against climate change because they felt that it actually distracted from dealing with domestic environmental issues, right? How do international politics play out? I'll give you an example here. In Brazil, there was a lot of discussion around Brazil's forests in the 2000s. And the fact that there was also global conversation about Brazil's forests as the lungs of the earth and so on and so forth ended up actually playing into how Brazilian politics around forests worked, right? So there's a two-way relationship there. So there's a whole set of things around climate politics in the country. They then get refracted through at least these three variables, right? One is political institutions, and by that I mean, how is the country structured to govern itself domestically? So the fact that Germany has a first past the post or a proportional representation, Germany has a proportional representation system means that the Green Party gets access to governance mechanisms, right? Once they reach a 5% threshold. That has been really important. In the US, you end up with two dominant parties, right? You don't actually have a voice for minority voices. Germany, to take the example further, also has corporatist mechanisms where labor, business, and government sit down regularly to try and hash things out. Does that lead to more space for climate policies as compared to a lobbying mechanism or in sort of an outsider mechanism which the UK and the US have? So those are the sorts of things that people occupy themselves with, and those will then go and shape climate politics, right? Who has access to decisions about renewable energy? In Germany, the industry has direct access through the mechanism of corporatism. Interaction with international processes operates here too. So this is in the academic literature what's called a two-level game. The fact that, for example, whether or not, let's take the example of India. The fact that India argues that it did not cause the problem leads to a certain sort of zone within India of political acceptability on climate outcomes, and does the global match that? Do we find, and I'll talk about this later, do we find that India takes its cues from China, other international influences as a aspiring great power? So there are things that happen at that level. And the third is sort of intriguing and very mechanical. When you have a new issue, do countries have a playbook? So the UK has a playbook, at least it did in the 2000s and the 1990s, of independent regulatory agencies and the building of a regulatory state, and this was a larger European story. So, and I'll talk about this, they set up a regulator because that's what you do. China sets up something called national leading groups to deal with these large and complex issues, where high-level representatives, including from the party, get together and figure out what to do next, right? So there are these bureaucratic patterns. So normally, the story would be this loop. What we've started seeing is that as a result of these filters and this pressure, countries are now actually putting in place lasting political climate institutions. And I'm arguing that they're shaped by ideas and interests, and I'll talk about how that is in a minute. And so you actually have two loops now going on, right? So how does the creation of these institutions further shape politics and then shape outcomes is the question that we want to ask. And I'm going to now take you through, so this is just to give you a little bit of a mental map, and now I'm going to take you through a couple of examples. I'm going to look at the UK, which is a front runner, and India, which is actually a different case of kind of an opportunistic structure, and I'll explain and map that out for you. Okay, the UK has been a complete front runner in this space. It has created institutions and laws that have been copied from Ireland to Germany to Nigeria to New Zealand, right? In some ways, I think unhelpfully so. But it was unlucky. It was actually unlikely political soil for all the reasons I gave you, right? There's no proportional representation. They don't have mechanisms for negotiation between different parts of society. So if you read the academic literature, everybody expected this sort of institution to emerge in Germany first. But what happened was in Germany, the auto industry was so dominant, and the transport ministry was kind of in cahoots in a sense, because they were sort of working closely together. They stopped those kinds of mechanisms emerging, while in the UK, and in the absence notably of any pushback on climate science, the Tories and the Labour Party, both in around the late 2000s, converged on the climate agenda and created the Climate Change Act, which was the first sort of act. There had been other acts before, but the first of this sort, which was really focused on mitigation. And this is a key point. It's mitigation, not that messy soup of other objectives. It's about emissions, and was enshrined in 5 yearly carbon budgets. Because they had, so every 5 years they produce a carbon budget for the country as a whole, and then there's a mechanism of how that gets resolved, and I'll talk about that. And the linchpin of this was something called the Climate Change Committee. So this is just a little image of it, the 7th carbon budget. It's a big deal in the UK when this gets announced. And the Climate Change Committee came out of that legacy of regulatory agencies. Interestingly, it only has advisory powers. It can't actually force anybody to do anything. It's an information-based regulatory mechanism. All the action happens in the line departments, right? Transport, housing, et cetera, et cetera. And so this is the kind of structure that resulted. And I just want to focus you on the Climate Change Committee here, which, as you can see, provides recommended carbon budgets, right? And something called what used to be the Environment Department got renamed as the Secretary of State for BEIS, Business, Energy, and Industrial Strategy. So very interesting. Environmentalists got really upset that this was basically going to be a capture by the business interests. But interestingly, it led to a parallel narrative. So from an emission-centric story, it became a story about how jobs could be created, industrial strategy could be developed. It kind of opened up the space for climate policy. And it's an example of how institutions shape the direction in which policy and politics go. So what happened as a result of this? Just to say that this also shows that all the line ministries, in a sense, continue their role, and BEIS is the sort of first among equals that assesses compliance with those budgets. So what happened? The carbon budget very effectively sets the direction. But ownership over that agenda is mixed. So electricity, it happened to be a moment when there was massive wind development in the North Sea, but transport didn't move quite as far and fast. The politics weren't as agreeable, and the fact of these budgets didn't actually induce the same kind of transformative shifts in the transport sector, right? So it helped, but it wasn't determinative to have this institutional structure. The Climate Change Committee, however, became extraordinarily important. So in broader conversations, not just in Parliament, but in public, so Friends of the Earth would point to their report, industry would point to their report, the wind industry would point to their report. And there were several times when the government would try and kind of step back from the recommendations, and because of the public pressure and the rock-solid analytical reputation of the Climate Change Committee, they had to stick with it, right? So it became, in an interesting way, a political ratchet mechanism against backsliding. In the absence of the Climate Change Committee, they may have just kind of, walked back those targets, but they found it hard because of the committee, its reputation, the fact that it had that independent role, the fact that it reported to Parliament, and so on. And you saw some positive feedback loops. So for example, wind energy was very important. From an initial concern with NIMBYism, like not in my backyard, actually, partly because of the BEIS, it ended up being a story where the potential for job creation became a big part of support for wind. And it became a positive feedback loop where, because of the access that the wind industry got, they were able to lobby for more incentives, and that led to more jobs. It became more politically popular, and that's the idea of a positive feedback loop, right? So the institutional structure helped build a positive feedback loop. So this is the UK story. An independent regulatory agency, information-based regulation, mitigation-focused carbon budgets. Okay? Let's look at India. India is a very different story. Climate change was just not on the political agenda. It's in opinion polls, it regularly ranks outside the top 10, right? Understandable. Air quality is more immediate, jobs, water, healthcare, education, essential basic poverty, right? So in a sense, what I've argued is that climate change is embedded in the political conversation through things like impacts on crop yields, floods, linkage with air pollution, potential for job creation, right? Those are the kind of narratives. And it's this narrative of co-benefits that I alluded to earlier, which was central in the National Action Plan on Climate Change, which was passed in 2008. It's not a legal document, it's an executive action plan. And I've talked to people who were part of that, and they were very clear. You know, China did it in a year before. India felt like they had to do it. They had to do it because the Prime Minister at the time, Manmohan Singh, went to a G8 meeting, and people asked him at the time of the financial crisis, and people started asking about climate change, and he just felt kind of unprepared. And so he said, we need something by the time I go back to this, the G8 meeting. And so they did, right? This was operationalized in terms of sectoral missions. So this is a graphic on the various sectoral missions. Since then, they've added more. And the institutional structure, unlike the UK, which was creation of a new agency, they just did layering. They didn't create new bodies. They just layered responsibilities on top in the following form, right? So you have, in the Prime Minister's office, you had a special cell on climate change. You changed the name of the Ministry of Environment and Forests to the Ministry of Environment, Forests, and Climate Change. There wasn't a whole lot of more capacity added. In fact, my colleagues and I did we filed right to information petitions, and we found that throughout the government of India, in 2019, there were 62 people with climate change responsibilities throughout this messy matrix, right? 62 is not a lot for a country of this size and scale. This is at the national level. So the point is no overarching new bodies, just this kind of layering, right, that happened, including in the Prime Minister's office, a lot of centralization and driving of things from the Prime Minister's office, also opening up of actions at the states, because India is a federal country. So that's important. I'm not going to talk much more about that, but we can go there in questions if people want. And what happened here? You ended up with this kind of opportunistic approach. Some missions just took off. Energy efficiency, solar missions. So the solar energy mission, its first target was 20 gigawatts of solar. At the time, India's capacity was around 250 or 300 gigawatts of capacity. Then the next target was 175, and the next target is now 500 gigawatts of solar. It's not one-to-one. You can't compare coal and renewables analogously because the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine. But it gives you a sense of the scale, right? And enterprising bureaucrats in these missions saw their opportunity to really create something and win political gain and win bureaucratic favor and get more resources for their ministry and so on and so forth, right? Other missions just did very little. So it was very idiosyncratic, and that's why I call it opportunistic. It was really created an opportunity structure for those who were able to take advantage. There was, however, very limited strategic direction, various efforts at setting up advisory councils and so on, but they weren't staffed, they didn't have analytical capacity, so no big picture direction setting analogous to a carbon budget. Very limited coordination, because you're handing coordination over to a Ministry of Environment. Remember, in the UK, it was business and industrial strategy, much bigger heft and scope, right? Here you have a Ministry of Environment, under-budgeted, and in the hierarchy relatively low. People tell me, you know, if the Secretary of Environment calls a meeting, the Secretary of Power won't come, the Finance Secretary certainly won't come, the Urban Development Secretary won't come. They all send flunkies because there's an implicit pecking order across ministries. But what it did do was create this kind of institutional template for mainstreaming climate change, the mission construct. So now India has a hydrogen mission. When we think there's a there, we create a mission, we try and staff it, we try and sort of create the incentive structures, and we created these mechanisms of positive feedback, as I described for the UK, with solar energy, right? So a national solar mission was championed by the Prime Minister's office. He gave it kind of personal heft. It then it was a space where the industry could lobby and get more and more advantages and more favorable policies. So for example, there's a must-buy provision in India's electricity system where you have to favor renewable energy over other sources, and that leads to this kind of virtuous cycle. So the institutional story didn't drive kind of a simplistic unilateral change, but it did create these kinds of pockets and spaces for opportunities and for positive feedback. Okay, what do we do with this? I'm going to sort of take all of this kind of textual detail and flatten it to 2 dimensions for the sake of provoking an argument and trying to sort of take the conversation forward. And this is what we did in the project. We argued that there were, broadly put, a limited number of varieties of climate governance in the world. It wasn't infinite, nor was there a unitary model. And it was useful to think about these climate governance models along 2 axes. One is this idea of mitigation-centric like the UK, or embedded like India, right? Is the story around climate change around climate qua climate, or is it around, and therefore around emissions, or is it around things like whether you'll have job creation, whether it impacts air quality, energy access, and so on, right? The second is, for a certain narrative, is the political polarization low or high? Obviously, low is better, right? And so in a sense, what I've given you is 2 of the cases of relatively low political polarization. In the case of India, it's low because it's below the radar, right? Nobody is trying to make it about climate change. If you try to make it about climate change, it would have become an argument about equity. We didn't solve the problem. Where's the finance, et cetera, et cetera. It became an argument about co-benefits. How do you get development and climate at the same time without compromising on both, right? So this is one version of the story. The UK is over here because it built these strategic climate institutions, as did Germany and China, and later on as did Australia, on the back of political agreement about addressing climate change. China is interesting because it started over here as a co-benefit story, particularly around air pollution, and then it kind of moved over here as the Chinese political narrative shifted to this idea of ecological civilization and a much larger industrial shift with climate as part of that, and low carbon development and technology as part of that. What happens down here? Well, down here you have cases of countries, and Australia is here, and I'll explain in a minute. I think the US was down here for much of the 1990s, where you're pushing for climate institutions, but you don't actually have political agreement around it. You're trying to make this about mitigation. So Australia passed a carbon price law in 2011, I think it is, 11 or 12, under Julia Gillard. Tony Abbott came in, and within 6 months, the whole thing was repealed, right? It led to the kind of unstable establishment of institutions. In South Africa and Brazil, you have a slightly different story. It's embedded in the sense that climate change is dominated in South Africa by coal politics and in Brazil by forest politics. Other issues are there, but these dominate. So climate politics equals forest politics in Brazil. And you have this scenario where you've been shifting back and forth between different administrations who create and then unravel rules and regulations down here. So you have unstable sectoral institutions, coal in one case and forests in the other, right? So this gives us a way to actually talk about and track what countries are doing. It allows us to ask some questions. Is everybody supposed to be back up here eventually? Is the way to address the problem for everybody to be here? Can you make progress if you're here? Clearly, you don't want to be down here, but which direction do you want to move in, right? So let's just kind of run this through looking at Australia and the US. So Australia, as I said, interestingly, back in 2012, not only did they create a carbon price, they created 2 other agencies. They created a Clean Energy Finance Corporation and a Renewable Energy Agency. Those were kept. And behind the scenes, they were sort of building the support for renewable energy in ways that contributed eventually to, in 2022, a climate bill being passed in Australia, right? So they were kind of small sectoral institutions, relatively thinly staffed, relatively thinly financed, but they were building these networks and building these spaces for renewable energy to become more and more powerful in Australia, right? So it's a story about institutions playing that role. The US, of course, after multiple efforts, I think most recently was McCain-Lieberman for a cap and trade bill, which would require the US to say, yes, we think climate is important. Yes, we're willing to commit on a decadal time frame to reducing emissions, and yes, we're willing to produce a price on carbon that has economic costs, right? And the politics didn't support it, right? So you basically sloshed around here for a decade or so, until in the Biden administration, they changed the conversation, right? And I'm not sure, so the term embedded is something we came up with a while ago, but it's a good way of describing a climate change act, because that's what the Inflation Reduction Act is, that packages healthcare and labels it inflation reduction, right? It's exactly kind of narrative building to figure out the art of the politically possible. And so I would argue that under the IRA, the US actually moved into this opportunistic space where there was space to move things along. Carbon dioxide removal, electric vehicles, et cetera, those sectors where they could build a political constituency, they were able to move the structure along. And what we have now, perhaps, is a shift in the last, what are we at? 30-something days, 50 days. Down here, where you're back in a world of conflicted energy politics between fossil fuel, renewable energy promotion, et cetera, right? So this is just by way of saying that, you know, this kind of diagram may help us think through this. It's worth speculating what would have happened if back here the US had invested in modest institutions to try and slowly build a constituency instead of going for the big bang of a carbon price in the face of unfavorable politics. And others know this country much better. Maybe nothing would have changed. But in other countries, that sort of dynamic has helped, right? Okay, what do I think we can learn from this? And I'm going to just take 5 minutes to conclude, Michael. What do we think we can learn from this? Climate institutions may be a missing link in that they're not explored enough, but they're no silver bullet, right? This idea of mitigation versus embedded narratives is really important. How do you build institutions that match national politics and national context? Don't try and build your institutions in ways that transcend what you can politically support. And it's worth noting that while the UK has a Paris-style ratcheting mechanism, most other countries don't, right? So there's not actually a domestic analog to what we built the global architecture for. There's a lot of bumbling through that happens in terms of creating those nationally determined contributions. I guess the key point I want to emphasize is this point about the power of weak institutions. There's something to be said about building weak institutions, the National Solar Mission in India, the Clean Energy Finance Corporation in Australia. There were analogous things in other countries, right? That allow progress to be made, positive feedback loops to develop, and institutional beachheads to be established that shift politics over time. So remember that circular diagram I showed you? Institutions can be a part of shifting politics over time. All this said, there are a few examples of institutions that provide effective top-down cooperation and coordination. And China is probably the biggest example where they have done that, because what China did is embed climate coordination in the national NRDC way, NDRC, National Development and Resources Reform Commission, sorry. I always confuse it with NRDC. National Development and Reform Commission. So climate change was embedded there, and there's a whole structure where they actually link to line ministries and to provinces and are empowered to actually manage that cooperation. I'm oversimplifying, but there is a structure to doing that. What's interesting is that there's scope for moving at a sectoral level even without those institutions. We have cases where sector paralysis set in even with strategy setting bodies like the UK, and sectors moved even without strategy setting bodies, like in Brazil, where wind energy actually received made a lot of progress because everybody is too busy fighting over forests, right? In the long run, to be up here, do we need to be thinking about, is the model not just around emissions, but around this kind of green development state where you're thinking about industrial strategy and transformation that brings jobs and other good things at the same time as you're addressing climate change? Okay, so the take-homes that I hope that you all will reflect on. I feel that national political shifts backed by narratives and institutions are really the primary driver of change in country after country. Global cooperation is important, but it's at this point an enabling part of the story. I don't think we're going to see it being the main driver of change. Narrative shifts, like we saw with co-benefits, like we saw with the IRA, can bring new political agreements and enable progress. National institutions, even weak ones, can enable this kind of ratchet mechanism and provide a way of keeping motion going when you don't have political agreement around a big bang. Sectoral actions are among the things that one can do. And all of this points to the importance of states and state capacity, but not necessarily in a crude way where you have to set very big ambitious targets and big machinery, but nimble and creative and flexible opportunities to accelerate that cycle between politics and institutions is what will drive national action, and I argue ultimately help us address this problem. Thanks, Michael.
Do you want to take the audience?
Sure.
Let me take with the microphone.
Thanks. We're going to go to questions now. So if you have a question in the audience, please raise your hand. I see one, two. May.
Mike for Michael.
May Young, I see two right there.
Mike for Michael. Oh, I think.
Do you want me to do something else? Oh, I'm so sorry.
So I think I'm going to let Navroz take his own question, but I want to ask you a couple of things first. Sure. Number one, one comment on the Biden administration and the transition. They were actually trying to rely on two institutional arrangements. One was the finance, but the other was regulation. And EPA provides, in theory, a stable institution where research goes on and where they have the power to actually get some things done, depending on the Supreme Court and Congress. Right. But if you go back to the ozone depletion problem, it was litigation against EPA which helped tip the balance in the United States, forcing the U.S. to have a policy on CFC. So it's an institution in which there are public levers on, and that can push it a little bit either way, but it was the balance between finance and regulation that I think the Biden administration envisioned as working over the long term, and neither of them is completely dead at this point. Right. That's number one. Number two, if you were doing it all over again, and you were right there very early in the pre-COP1 days, in the pre-Rio days, one question I would ask is, what other strategy was there? You could go around and there was nobody to talk to about this in the US, hardly, or any other country, and to get a conversation, you needed to bring a few countries together. There was some logic, I think, in trying to raise national expectations that this was a problem that had to be looked at if there were people at some other level, which was less controllable by by governments, forcing the conversation.
Right. Take it from there. Okay, great. Let me quickly try and address those two very complicated and important questions. When we did this project, my colleague who wrote the US paper, we had a lot of discussions with him, and he was arguing something very similar to what you argued, Michael, that in a sense you have the EPA. It is incredibly well-staffed and capable, at least as of now. And a dedicated institution may in fact not be what you need. And I would argue that in a sense, there's some power to that argument, but at the same time, if you're trying to if you're thinking about, so the EPA got into the act through the endangerment finding, which found that carbon dioxide was a pollutant and therefore could be regulated, right? But listen to those words, carbon dioxide as a pollutant that has to be regulated. It's entirely focusing on the cost side of the story. It's not focusing on the possible upsides. It's not focusing on the story around the job gains that eventually drove the politics around the Inflation Reduction Act, right? And if you had built an institution with a different DNA that was really about enabling that industrial transition where low carbon futures and resilient futures, and I should say this is all a mitigation world, we haven't talked about adaptation, it's a whole other space that's very relevant to talk about. But if you had an institutional structure in another world which was organized somewhat differently and could start building constituents for that point of view, maybe it would have been a little bit different, right? So that's one part of the story. So Michael's alluding to the fact that, back in 1990, I was running around organizing NGOs and so on, trying to get them to come to climate negotiations. And the conversation was shaped by the ozone depletion story and really about driving down, so the analog was, the chemicals that cause ozone depletion, greenhouse gases, and how do you, again, regulate and drive those down. It was all about targets and timetables. And a couple of countries, I think it was Japan, proposed something called a pledge and review structure back then that said, you tell us, you as in countries, tell us what you're willing to do. We'll add it up, we'll see where we are, and we'll come back in a few years. And I think that story would have allowed certainly developing countries to think in a much more open-ended way about how their interests might be served by restructuring their development paths, as opposed to making it narrowly around emissions limitations, which they saw as entirely threatening. So I do think this kind of narrative and institution linkage could have played out differently in another world 30 years ago, 35 years ago, and counting. Right?
Question?
Please. Yeah, but actually, do you? Okay.
Okay, nice. Go ahead. You go first.
You go. Maybe we'll take 2 or 3 and then together.
I know we have several in the room. Yeah, go ahead. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Arthur and postdoc in the Climate Futures Initiative here. It's really fascinating talk, a lot of knowledge to draw from. I was wondering about, so on that helpful graph here at the end, you said it was really important to acknowledge these different types of institutions, frameworks that you might adopt. But what I noticed is, really, it was this difference between polarized or not that was making the difference. If the politics are polarized, you're dead in the water no matter what the institution is. That seemed to be what the graph was illustrating. And I see that you're the idea of pointing towards co-benefits, I suspect that's trying to make it less polarized. That's kind of the purpose and the leverage that's trying to pull is saying, well, if we can say this is for everyone's benefit, then you don't have to have this polarization. But I just wonder if that's a little bit too rosy of a story, that, this is, there's a lot of urgency at this point to take climate action, where this, just last year was the first time at a single year that we crossed 1.5 degrees. We're, on target to make that the average over the next 10 years. And we're nowhere near where we need to be. Is it, in your view, is it really true that merely by going kind of more self-interested and, if we just do the climate action, which is in our kind of narrowly construed economic benefit, will that be enough? Or do we need these grander narratives, narratives about coming together for the benefit of all, for our ecologies, more holistic and maybe green hippie sort of things, but that maybe that's what's needed to actually get to the change. So what do you think about that challenge? Thanks.
Okay. Should we take 2 or 3 and then?
Thank you, Navras. I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about the effectiveness of institutions. I think you alluded to that, but I'm in particular curious to hear about thoughts on 2 aspects. One is that how should we evaluate the effectiveness of an institution? For example, for some national context, does it mean that it's actually more effective if we have a more opportunistic and also weak institution? And the second aspect is that if we want to really thinking about the drivers for the effectiveness, do you still see these 2 dimensions, idea and interest, as the key determinants for the effectiveness?
Would you like another question before you answer?
Yeah.
Mayoung, I think in the red jacket right here, right in front of you. Yep. All right.
Thanks. Really interesting talk, and I strongly agree that these national level institutions are critically important. I was wondering if you could comment on our current situation in the United States, given that there's an enormous rollback happening across the board, both on the climate side and on the environmental side. So the co-benefit argument isn't holding up here, and what that might imply for the whole global effort.
We have a similar question online from emeritus faculty about politically motivated anti-climate views and whether institutions have much power. So, related question.
Okay, great. Let me try and take these more or less in order. And thank you. It's really wonderful. Thank you for my colleagues as well for being here from CPRI. Really appreciate it. The question that the first question asked is what you get a lot. Do we, and I am caricaturing a bit, but do we have the time for this kind of piecemeal approach, given the scale and nature of the challenge? Don't we need to sort of have a much bigger story about the existential nature of the crisis? And is this kind of embedded story, let's work where self-interest takes us, is that going to be good enough? And my response is really twofold. One is, I don't think that there is any option but to say we can only go where in democratic societies there is a revealed preference in terms of the direction of travel that meets self-interest objectives. And that is even stronger in the developing world, right? So one reason there's been a pushback against the existential story is it says things like, to a country like Nigeria, sorry, but there's no time and space for you to develop your fossil fuel industry anymore. Well, only 60% odd of Nigerians have access to electricity. What are they going to say to that? What are they going to say when the Norwegians are still developing? So it leads to that kind of zero-sumness, right? There has to be a story where there's progress that happens. That used to be a narrative for the developing world. It's clearly now a global narrative. You see it in France with the Gilets Jaunes movement, pushing back against fuel taxes. I think it's incumbent on us who care about climate change to find ways of telling stories about how you can achieve a bunch of objectives together. And I think it's a losing strategy to say, we all need to be drinking from the same, we need to get to the point where existential climate politics is a number one or number two voting issue in every country, and that should be our objective. Because that's not going to happen for a very long time. It's certainly not going to happen in the developing world. And the argument that by making it about climate existentialism, you'll move faster, I think is actually empirically not proved to be the case. I think actually building the political conditions, arguably we would have moved faster if we'd gone down this path, as I said in response to Michael's question a couple of decades ago. So this is not to dismiss the scale of the problem or the urgency of it, but it is to dismiss the idea that scale and urgency translate into accelerated action. I don't think they do, because they have to be mediated by politics, right?
Let's take two more questions.
And then,
We're running out of time.
okay. And then I'll take all of them together.
Right.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks, Rose. Related to the very first question, I was wondering what recommendations you have for any changes to mechanisms in the COP system or international relations generally related to climate, so that we're moving away from a more game theoretic framework and can better represent domestic interest within these international relations. And particularly, I'm thinking about subnational governments and how they can be built into being actually permitted to be in these conversations better. Thanks.
Hi, I have a question. Navroz, it seems like mitigation-centric institutions are more effective than embedded institutions. So would you have some advice that if countries like India have to move from embedded to mitigation-centric institutions, how would that happen without inviting political polarization?
Okay, let me just take those. Let me just start with the last one because it's the most focused, and some of the others are a bit larger. So Rohit, that it's not quite what I said that mitigation-centric are more effective. In fact, what I was saying is it's a mistake to try and build mitigation-centric entities or institutions when you don't have the politics to support it. It's an open question whether eventually you have to get there, right? And one thing I didn't have time to get into is a lot of the institutions that are successful, like the Australian ones, are benefit-sharing institutions. By definition, those are politically more acceptable. The rubber hits the road when you have to develop cost-allocating institutions like a carbon tax, right? And the question is, eventually to get to net zero, you probably do have to have those. But the argument that you do have to have those doesn't mean that you don't maximize on the gains you get from benefit-sharing institutions in the short run. So there will be a time when that shift may need to happen, but my argument is you do what makes sense in a given political context at the moment. The question on effectiveness. So it's a difficult question and in a sense, the evasive answer from a kind of political science standpoint would be the most effective institutions are those that bring about the biggest changes in political agreement, right? So it's a self-referential argument, but by design. Because in fact, that should be the objective. And there's two ways to think about institutions. Institutions help drive politics. Design the institutions in ways that they maximally do so, right? And there's no analytical benchmark against which they can be held. Then there's an instrumental side of institutions. Do they provide a space for strategy setting? Do they provide a space for deliberation? I didn't talk about South Africa much, but South Africa has a Just Transition Commission, which brings the coal unions together with Eskom, together with the government to try and hash things out before they flare up. So you can create benchmarks for subcategories of institutions, coordination institutions, deliberation institutions, strategy setting institutions, but perhaps not for the whole thing together. Let me take Melissa's question and then I'll end with Denise's. What's the recommendation for the COPs? I've been a bit frustrated by the Paris Agreement. So the Paris Agreement, I actually was a supporter of it. Many people felt that it was kind of a cop-out to in fact move away from targets and timetables that are then filtered down. And for exactly the logic as the first questioner, we need to have some kind of absolutism and guarantees. And I think that the Paris Agreement is more subtle and more likely to shift politics. But then we did something funny. We short-circuited it. Before countries even came up with their first round of NDCs, we had the Secretary General and others saying, that's not going to get us to 1.5, ramp up your pledges. So we didn't believe in the mechanism because the Paris mechanism is a learning by doing mechanism. You set the targets, you go home, you try and shift your politics, you find it's easier than you think, you come back. That cycle we never actually went through. So in a sense, I've pushed back against the language of ambition in climate. We should be talking about implementation, not ambition. You talk about an ambition gap. If the ambition gap is, those numbers are huge, 30-odd gigatons emissions gap, it's paralyzing. Focus on what you can do in the next 5 years rather than thinking about 2030, 2040, 2070, right? So that's I think bring the lens forward into the next 5 years is I guess what I would say. Denise, I put off your question partly because I don't have a very good answer to it. What's the comment on the current state? In a sense, I was aiming that last slide to be a slightly hopeful message, in the sense that if we don't think that the driver is global cooperation, even though it's an important enabler, global cooperation is going to be a struggle. But there's a lot that can happen in national levels. A lot of the action on clean energy is happening in Asia. Africa is making choices about infrastructure right now that are going to lock it into high carbon and low carbon paths. These are all things that can be addressed by national politics, aid in the right places from other countries perhaps, key interventions around how you build your cities, how you create jobs, around things like air pollution and the linkages. There's space to work on. None of those spaces have gone away, right? So I think that's, in a sense, the hopeful message that I see. There's a lot that is still going on and that can be made to be productive even in the atmosphere we're in now, where in fact you don't really talk you're discouraged from talking openly about climate change as an issue. Well, in that context, the embedded story is your friend. Right?
Let's thank Navroz again for a very illuminating.
Thank you.
Are you going to hang around for a while?
Yeah, yeah.
He'll be here if you want to talk. Come up and talk.